4 songs, 4 different artists, 4 straight number ones, all written by the same man in just 4 months. It's a record so impossible that nearly 50 years later, no songwriter has even come close. Not Taylor Swift, not Max Martin, not even the Beatles. But in 1978, one man with a falsetto that could shatter glass didn't just dominate the charts, he became the charts. Barry Gibb wrote 5 of the top 10 songs in America at the exact same time. How did the songwriter behind the Bee Gees pull off the most unbreakable streak in music history? And what was the cost of living at the absolute peak of creative genius? This is the story of 4 songs that changed everything. The year was 1977, and Barry Gibb was about to rewrite the rules of popular music. Most people knew him as the falsetto voice behind the Bee Gees' disco dominance. But what they didn't know was that Barry had become something far more powerful than just a performer. He'd evolved into a one-man hit factory, the kind of songwriter who could walk into any studio, hear a melody in his head, and walk out with a future number 1 single. The Bee Gees had already pulled off one of music's greatest comebacks. They'd started in the 1960s as Beatles-inspired balladeers, then watched their careers nearly crumble by the early 70s. But Barry possessed something that separated him from every other songwriter of his generation: pure adaptability. When disco began bubbling up from underground clubs in New York and Philadelphia, the Bee Gees' manager Robert Stigwood saw an opening. The band leaned hard into the groove. Barry developed that signature falsetto, first experimenting with it on nights on Broadway in 1975. The result was electric. By 1977, Barry's songwriting engine was running in absolute overdrive. The Bee Gees were deep into crafting what would become the Saturday Night Fever soundtrack. But then Stigwood approached them with a game-changing idea. Why not spread the Gibb magic around, write for other artists under his management? The logic was simple. The execution would be legendary. First came You Should Be Dancing, then Love So Right. Then a flood of songs, not just for the Bee Gees, but for other performers like Yvonne Elliman, Samantha Sang, and Andy Gibb, Barry's younger brother. Still, no one could have predicted what would happen in early 1978. One after another, songs written or co-written by Barry Gibb hit number 1 on the U.S. Billboard Hot 100. Different singers, different styles, but the same signature touch, that unmistakable Gibb DNA that made radio programmers weak in the knees. The streak wasn't planned. It wasn't some calculated marketing stunt. It was simply the result of Barry writing songs so perfectly tuned to the cultural moment that America couldn't resist. But behind the smiles and the record-breaking statistics, a question loomed. When you're standing at the very peak of the mountain, there's only one direction left to go. It all started with a song that would become the heartbeat of an entire generation. December 1977. Saturday Night Fever exploded in theaters, and its soundtrack began rewriting chart history. The Bee Gees already had How Deep Is Your Love at number 1. But Stayin' Alive was something else entirely, a cultural detonation that would echo for decades. Barry wrote the song with his brothers Robin and Morris in a French chateau, originally as part of a set of demos for the film. But here's the kicker: that relentless, hypnotic drum track that drives the entire song. It wasn't even live, it was a loop. Drummer Dennis Bryan's performance from Night Fever repeated endlessly to create that unmistakable disco heartbeat. The genius was in the simplicity. The lyrics, dripping with swagger and defiance, came from Barry's fascination with urban survival. It was about staying alive in the big city, he later explained. The attitude had to match John Travolta's strut in that opening scene. And match it did. When Stayin' Alive hit number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100 in February 1978, it didn't just top the charts, it became the anthem of disco culture itself. The song that would make white polyester suits iconic and turn a simple finger point into a dance move recognized around the world. But here's where the story gets truly incredible. The same week Stayin' Alive conquered the charts, another Barry Gibb composition was climbing fast, a song performed by someone else entirely. Could Barry actually compete with himself at the top of the American music scene? The music industry was about to find out, because while Stayin' Alive was dominating radio waves across the country, Barry's pen was already crafting what would become his next chart topper. And this time, it wouldn't be for the Bee Gees. It would be for family. Andy Gibb, Barry's youngest brother, was just 20 years old and already a rising pop star. His debut single, I Just Want to Be Your Everything, also written by Barry, had been a massive hit, but now his follow-up was ready to take over the world. The question was, could Barry Gibb really knock himself off the top of the charts? March 1978 would provide the answer. The answer came in the form of brotherly love and a song born in paradise. Andy Gibb was hesitant. His big brother Barry had just handed him a track called Love is Thicker Than Water, written during a family trip to Bermuda in 1976. Andy worried it didn't have the same energy as his smash hit debut. The melody felt different, more intimate, more vulnerable. Barry's response was simple, trust me. Those two words would make history. By March 1978, Love is Thicker Than Water didn't just climb the charts, it demolished them. The song dethroned Stayin Alive, Barry's own masterpiece, from the #1 spot. Think about that for a moment. Barry Gibb had effectively knocked himself off the top of the Billboard Hot 100 in the entire history of popular music. This was unheard of. Two different artists, two back-to-back chart toppers, both flowing from the same creative mind. But Barry wasn't just writing these hits. He was producing them, arranging them, shaping their sound in the studio. He was crafting the sonic landscape of American radio, one song at a time. Andy's version of the song showcased a softer side of the Gibb magic. Where Stayin Alive was all swagger and street attitude, Love is Thicker Than Water was pure emotion wrapped in a melody that seemed to float on air. The production was lush but intimate, proving Barry could write for voices completely different from his own falsetto. Radio couldn't get enough. The song dominated airwaves for weeks, with DJs marveling at the fact that Barry Gibb was literally competing with himself for America's attention. Music industry executives were stunned. 2 consecutive #1s from the same songwriter was rare enough. But replacing yourself at the top, that was the stuff of legend. Yet as Love is Thicker Than Water ruled the charts, something else Barry had penned was already gaining momentum. A song with a completely different vibe for an artist outside the Gibb family circle. The question everyone in the music business was asking, could Barry's songwriting genius survive beyond the Bee Gees' disco world? Could he adapt his style for artists who weren't related to him by blood? The third strike was about to prove that Barry Gibb's magic knew no boundaries, and it would come with a fever that would define an entire era. Sometimes the biggest hits come from the smallest moments. Night Fever wasn't supposed to be the defining song of the disco era. It started with Barry casually strumming in the studio, finding a chord progression that made his fingers tingle. Something about those chords felt electric, like they were channeling the pulse of Saturday night itself. The Bee Gees built the track around that simple progression, layering Barry's falsetto with harmonies that seemed to shimmer like a disco ball. Producer Robert Stigwood was so captivated by the song that he wanted to change the entire movie's title. Originally called Saturday Night, he pushed to rename it Saturday Night Fever, partly because of this track's infectious energy. The song didn't just capture disco, it crystallized it. Released as a single in February 1978, Night Fever climbed the charts with unstoppable momentum. Right as Love is Thicker Than Water was peaking, Barry's latest creation was positioning itself for another takeover. By March, the inevitable happened. Night Fever dethroned Andy's song, giving Barry his third consecutive #1 hit as a songwriter. More incredibly, it made him the only person in music history to replace himself at #1 twice in a row. Critics called it saturation. Radio programmers joked they might as well rename the top 40 Barry's Countdown. The man wasn't just dominating American radio, he was rewriting the rules of what was possible, but Barry saw it differently. You just try to serve the song, he said in an interview during the height of his streak. If it works, it works. That humble approach masked something extraordinary. While other songwriters struggled to craft one hit, Barry was effortlessly churning out chart toppers across multiple artists and styles. From the street smart swagger of Stayin Alive to the tender vulnerability of Love is Thicker Than Water to the pure disco euphoria of Night Fever, each song felt completely different, yet unmistakably Gibb. The music industry was now watching in fascination and slight terror. How far could this streak go? As it turned out, Barry had one more bullet in the chamber, a ballad that would prove his songwriting genius wasn't limited to disco beats and falsetto vocals. The fourth and final strike was coming, and it would arrive through the voice of a woman who could make hearts break with a single note. Sometimes the most powerful moment in any streak is knowing when to change the game entirely. If I Can't Have You wasn't supposed to be Yvonne Elliman's song. Originally, Barry had written it for the Saturday Night Fever soundtrack, and the Bee Gees had even recorded their own version. But Robert Stigwood, ever the strategist, made a calculated decision. Give the song to Yvonne to add variety to the soundtrack. It was a gamble that would make history. Barry didn't just hand over the song, he completely reimagined it for Yvonne's voice. Gone were the falsetto edges and disco flourishes. Instead, he crafted an arrangement that leaned into raw, passionate emotion. The result was a ballad that felt like a desperate plea, delivered with the kind of vulnerability that could stop listeners in their tracks. Released in April 1978, If I Can't Have You didn't climb the charts, it conquered them. The song shot straight to number one, replacing Night Fever and completing one of the most impossible feats in music history. 4 consecutive Billboard Hot 100 number ones, all written or co-written by Barry Gibb, Stayin Alive by the Bee Gees, Love is Thicker Than Water by Andy Gibb, Night Fever by the Bee Gees, If I Can't Have You by Yvonne Elliman Billboard. Confirmed it at the time, no songwriter in history had ever achieved such a streak. Nearly 5 decades later, the record still stands untouched. But here's what made this achievement even more staggering. Barry wasn't just dominating the number one spot. At one point in March 1978, he had written or co-written 5 of the top 10 songs on the Billboard Hot 100 simultaneously. Emotion by Samantha Sang, another Barry composition, was sitting in the top 10 right alongside his 4 consecutive chart toppers. Music journalists were stunned. The Bee Gees and their extended circle weren't just popular, they were inescapable. This wasn't about chart positions anymore. This was about complete cultural saturation. Barry Gibb had become bigger than the charts themselves. He had become the sound of America. But with such dominance came an inevitable question. How long could one man sustain this level of creative pressure? And what would happen when the world finally decided it had had enough of the Gibb magic? The answer would come sooner than anyone expected. Behind the glittering success and gold records, a different story was unfolding, one of exhaustion, pressure, and the human cost of creative genius. Barry Gibb was working around the clock. While America danced to his melodies, he was splitting his time between writing for the Bee Gees, producing for other artists, and managing a media frenzy that seemed to grow more intense with each chart topper. He was known to record vocal takes deep into the night, then wake up hours later to arrange strings for another track. In those years, we were in the studio every day, Barry later admitted. No time to breathe. The constant demand for perfection from himself, from the label, from millions of fans, meant that the pure joy of songwriting sometimes got buried under the grind. Every melody had to be flawless. Every lyric had to connect with the masses. The pressure was suffocating, but the real challenge wasn't creative burnout, it was cultural backlash. By late 1978, certain rock critics had begun targeting disco as artificial and soulless, with the Bee Gees painted as the primary villains. Some radio stations allegedly reduced their airplay, fearing listener fatigue. The very success that had made Barry untouchable was now making him a target. It's impossible to be on top forever, Barry would later reflect. But in 1978, with hits still flowing like water, it felt like the Gibb empire could last forever. The breaking point came in the summer of 1979 with an event that would become infamous, Disco Demolition Night in Chicago, a radio stunt where thousands of disco records were blown up on a baseball field, turning into a near riot that symbolized America's rejection of the genre. The Bee Gees became collateral damage in the public's disco backlash. Suddenly, the same radio stations that couldn't play enough Barry Gibb songs were treating them like cultural poison. Yet here's the remarkable thing. Even as the Bee Gees were pushed off American playlists, even as disco became a dirty word, Barry's historic streak remained untouched. No other songwriter could match that 4-in-a-row run. Why? Because it wasn't really about disco at all. It was about Barry Gibb's supernatural ability to tap into melody, emotion, and perfect timing. His songs didn't just follow trends, they created them. And that kind of genius doesn't disappear just because the world moves on. The disco era died, but Barry Gibb's songwriting immortality had only just begun. Even as American radio turned its back on the Bee Gees, Barry proved his genius extended far beyond any single genre. In the years that followed, he penned massive hits for Barbra Streisand, Woman in Love, Dionne Warwick, Heartbreaker, and the unforgettable duet between Kenny Rogers and Dolly Parton, Islands in the Stream. All chart toppers, all classic songs, but nothing quite matched the sheer cultural dominance of that 4-month period in 1978. Industry veterans still call it the perfect storm, the right songs, the right artists, the right cultural moment, all colliding around one man who seemed to have a direct line to America's musical soul. But here's the question that haunts music historians. Will anyone ever break Barry's record? In today's fragmented music landscape, with streaming playlists replacing radio gatekeepers and audiences split across countless micro-genres, the idea of one songwriter dominating the entire chart seems almost impossible. The music industry has changed so dramatically that Barry's achievement feels less like a record and more like a relic from a different universe. And maybe that's exactly the point. Barry Gibb's 4 consecutive number ones weren't just about timing or luck. They were the product of relentless work, deep musical instincts, and a rare ability to write for voices completely different from his own. Most importantly, they captured a moment when melody was the universal language and radio still had the power to crown kings. A song is only as good as the person who sings it, Barry once said. His streak proved he could make anyone sound like a star. Today, nearly 50 years later, that record stands untouched, unmatched, and seemingly unbreakable. It's a time capsule from an era when one person's creativity could literally shape the soundtrack of America. Some records aren't meant to be broken, they're meant to remind us what's possible when pure talent, perfect timing, and unstoppable creative fire all collide in one extraordinary moment. Barry Gibb's streak is more than just a footnote in music history. It's proof that sometimes lightning doesn't just strike twice, it strikes 4 times in a row. What do you think? Could anyone pull this off in today's music industry? Drop your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more untold stories behind music's most jaw-dropping moments.